I used to believe that I had to be perfect for God to use me, that I needed to be whole, polished, clean, and emotionally unbreakable to be seen by Him, let alone be called by Him. I thought God chose women who were already brave, women who had it all together, women who knew how to walk in rooms with purpose and strength. But I wasn't any of those things. I was the kind of woman who had learned how to make herself small, so small that she could disappear into the background without anyone noticing. I was the woman who had learned to smile when she wanted to cry, to nod when she wanted to scream, to survive when she longed to be free. I had become skilled at hiding, not just hiding bruises, but hiding truths. I carried secrets that bruised my soul long after the marks on my skin had faded. Secrets about the words he said, the looks he gave, the way the atmosphere would shift when he entered a room. See, he didn't always hit me. Sometimes he just looked at me with disgust. Sometimes he spoke to me like I was a child, a nuisance, a weight around his neck. Sometimes it was the silence that hurt the most, the cold stares, the refusal to say I'm sorry, the intentional absence of love. His kindness was a currency I had to earn, and most days I was bankrupt. I remember how the silence in our home felt louder than any argument. Silence was a weapon. It screamed, "You're not worth my time." It screamed, "You should be grateful I even stayed." Over time, I started to believe those screams. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes were tired, her smile was strained, her spirit was dimmed. I used to have dreams so, but somewhere between the slammed doors and the sleepless nights, I lost those too, and with them, I lost my voice. So when people in church would say, "God has a purpose for your life," I would smile politely, but inside, I was screaming, "Not me. Not someone like me." I believed in a God who could redeem, but only for others. I believed He could call, but only the women who hadn't been used up, who hadn't been broken, who hadn't made the kinds of compromises I had to make just to survive. I thought I was too far gone, too bruised, too ashamed, too unworthy. I believed I was damaged goods. But what no one told me is that God calls women who have scars, that He whispers to women who've been silenced, that He sees the ones hiding in the shadows and calls them out by name, that He restores what others have broken, and He builds something holy from what looks like ruin. That was the part of the gospel I didn't understand, not until it became my lifeline. I still remember the night I left. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it was quiet. Terrifyingly quiet. I packed what I could in the dark. I grabbed my babies. I left behind the wedding photos that had long lost their meaning, the fancy dishes I was never allowed to use, and the story I had told myself over and over to justify staying. I stepped into the unknown with a trembling heart and tear-streaked face, but I stepped out. I cried out to God that night, not with poetic words or pretty prayers, but with groans and questions and desperation. "What now, Lord? Where do I go from here?" I had no answers. I had no plan. I was exhausted, terrified, alone. And yet, somehow, I was also free. And in that moment of complete vulnerability, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not fear, not panic. I felt seen. God didn't meet me with thunder. He didn't shout. He didn't demand I clean myself up first. He simply whispered. In the quiet, I heard Him say, "Daughter, I never stopped loving you." And those words, that whisper, broke me open in the best way. I wept not because I felt unworthy, but because I was finally beginning to believe I was loved, that maybe He had been with me all along, watching, weeping with me, waiting for me to say yes. And for the first time in years, I whispered back, "I'm here, Lord, I'm listening." I didn't have much. My heart was still learning how to beat again. My voice trembled. My soul had forgotten how to dream. But I offered Him my small, fragile yes, and I've come to believe that's all He ever really needed. Not perfection, not performance, just a willing heart. It didn't happen all at once. Healing never does. It began slowly, like the rising of the sun after a long, brutal night. I started by joining a women's group at church. I sat in the back. I didn't say much at first. I was still afraid people would see through me, that they'd see the cracks, the shame, the parts of me that didn't look church. But something in that room was different. These women didn't pretend to be perfect. They cried, they laughed, They prayed, and little by little, I started to open up. Then one day, someone asked me to pray. I panicked, my hand shook, my voice cracked, but I said yes. That shaky, quiet prayer was the beginning of something I didn't even know God had been preparing. That yes turned into another, and then another. And then one day, a woman came up to me in tears after group. She looked me in the eyes and said, "You said what?" "I've been too afraid to say thank you." And in that moment, I realized something beautiful. God was using the very pain I had begged him to take away. He was turning my wounds into words that heal. He was using my brokenness as a bridge for someone else's healing. This is just the beginning of the story. I'm still walking the path. I'm still learning to believe I'm not what he said I was. I'm still battling those late-night echoes that whisper lies in the dark. But now, I know the truth. God doesn't wait for us to be healed to use us. He meets us in the middle. In the mess, in the pain, and he calls us beautiful even when all we see is ashes. To every woman listening, every woman who's hidden her pain behind a practiced smile, who's been told she's too much or not enough, who had to gather every ounce of courage just to survive another day. You are not what happened to you. You are not the sum of his words, or his fists, or his silence. You are not disqualified. You are not invisible. You are not used up. You are called, not because you're strong, but because God is, not because you've figured it all out, but because you're willing to keep showing up. Not because you're fully healed, but because you've walked through the fire and you made it out. Healing didn't come quickly. It came in layers, like peeling back years of silence, fear, and self-doubt. I wanted to believe that once I left, things would immediately get better. But healing doesn't always come with freedom. Sometimes, it's in freedom that the real pain begins to surface, to the buried grief, the stolen identity, the wounds that were easier to ignore when you were in survival mode. After leaving, I found myself lost in the aftermath. I wasn't who I used to be, but I didn't yet know who I was becoming. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, not because I missed him, but because I missed the version of me that had once believed in love, in safety, in dreams. It's strange, isn't it? How you can mourn something that was never truly safe. How your body can feel the absence of what hurt it, simply because it had gotten used to it. Trauma doesn't just leave when the door closes behind you. It follows you. It sneaks into your thoughts, your relationships, your sense of worth. Some days I felt powerful, brave, unstoppable, and other days, I couldn't get out of bed. There were times I found myself doubting my own memories, wondering if I had exaggerated, if maybe I had misunderstood, if maybe it was my fault after all. That's what years of gaslighting does. It rewrites your truth until you're not sure what's real anymore. But even in those moments of doubt, I kept hearing the whisper, "I see you. I haven't forgotten you." I started talking to God, not like some distant deity, but like a friend who sat with me in the dark. I didn't use fancy prayers. I didn't know any. I just told him how I felt confused, broken, unworthy. And in that honest place, he met me, not with judgment, but with grace, not with demands, but with comfort. He wasn't disappointed in me for staying as long as I did. He wasn't angry that I had questioned him. He simply stayed. And that, more than anything, began to heal me, the presence of a God who didn't flinch at my mess. In the weeks and months that followed, I began to reclaim my voice. At first, it was quiet, hesitant. I had spent so long being told I was too emotional, too sensitive, too dramatic. I had learned to second-guess myself. But slowly, I started to recognize the difference between humility and suppression, between peace and silence, between obedience to God and fear of man. There is a holiness in a woman who begins to speak again after years of being silenced. There is something sacred about the tremble in her voice when she tells the truth for the first time, not just to others, but to herself. I started writing again, just in a journal at first. Thoughts, prayers, pieces of pain I didn't know how to say out loud. Some days it was angry scribbles. Other days, it was full of hope. Sometimes, I just wrote the same words over and over. "Help me, Lord. Help me believe you still have a plan." And over time, I began to feel something stir inside me, a flicker of purpose. Not the kind of purpose that shows up on stages or in applause. A quieter purpose, the kind that whispers keep going, keep healing. Someone needs your story. I began to understand that my story was not just about what I had endured, it was about what God was doing in me through it all. That I wasn't just a survivor, I was a living testimony of God's faithfulness, and that realization began to shift everything. I wasn't disqualified, I was chosen to walk through fire and come out with compassion, chosen to feel deeply so I could comfort deeply, chosen to carry scars, not as proof of weakness, but as proof of resurrection. That's the thing about Jesus. He doesn't erase your story, He redeems it. He doesn't ask you to forget the pain, He gives it meaning. And I began to see how even the worst parts of my past were being transformed in His hands. The fear that once kept me silent became the fire that helped me speak. The nights I cried alone became the well of empathy I now draw from when I sit with other hurting women. My past didn't disqualify me from ministry, it qualified me for it. Still, the enemy doesn't give up. There were days the shame crept back in. Days I heard his voice in my head, telling me I wasn't enough, that I was too broken to be a mother, too fragile to lead, too wounded to love again. But that's when I had to remind myself that my identity isn't rooted in what he said, it's rooted in what God says. And God calls me beloved, whole, called. Not later, not once I have it all figured out, but now, in the middle, in the becoming. Sometimes healing looked like crying in my car after dropping my kids off at school. Sometimes it looked like showing up to church even when I didn't feel like worshiping. Sometimes it looked like saying no when I would have said yes just to keep the peace. Each small step, each quiet decision was a victory, and God celebrated every one. One of the most powerful moments in my journey came when I sat across from another woman new to our church. Quiet, haunted, and she told me she was thinking about leaving her husband. I didn't rush to give advice. I didn't quote scripture. I just listened. And then, when she finished, I said, I know, I've been there. And the way she looked at me, I'll never forget it. Like someone had finally seen her. Like she wasn't alone. That's when I realized this was ministry. Not on a stage, not with a microphone, but in whispered conversations and shared tears, in holding space for someone else's pain. Because I knew what it was like to carry it alone. I didn't have a seminary degree. I hadn't gone through leadership training, but I had something even more powerful. I had lived it. I had survived it. I had found God in the rubble, and now I could show others the way out. That's the beauty of redemption. It doesn't erase your past. It transforms it into a map for someone else's healing. And yet, even in that, I've had to learn how to take care of myself, to rest, to let God minister to me, I'm not always strong. There are still nights when the memories return, when I question my worth, when I feel the weight of being both a survivor and a guide. But that's when I remember, I'm not the savior. I'm just a daughter who said yes. I don't have to carry the whole world. I just have to stay surrendered. I'm learning to trust my voice again, to write, to speak, to pray out loud without fear. I am learning that courage doesn't mean the fear is gonna, it just means you show up anyway. That obedience doesn't require perfection, it only requires faith. That God isn't looking for flawless vessels. He's looking for willing ones. And friend, if you're listening and your hands are still shaking, your heart still breaking, your mind still battling the lies He planted, know this. You are not alone. You are not too much. You are not too late. There is a future for you, not in spite of your past, but because of it. The very places where you were wounded may become the places where others are healed. God is not done with you. Not now, not ever. What the enemy used to try and destroy you, God is already turning into destiny. So keep going, keep healing, keep saying yes, because your story isn't over, it's just beginning. There's a moment in every healing journey where you stop surviving and begin living again. It doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't come with fanfare or flashing signs. It sneaks in quietly like a breath you didn't know you were holding, finally exhaling. For me, it was a morning like any other. I was washing dishes, sunlight coming through the kitchen window, the kids laughing about something in the other room. And for a split second, I realized I wasn't afraid. I wasn't walking on eggs. I wasn't bracing for a slammed door or a cruel word. I was simply safe. And that feeling, as unfamiliar as it was, brought tears to my eyes. Safety was something I had to not just physical safety, but emotional, spiritual, and relational safety. Because when you've lived in chaos long enough, peace feels foreign, kindness feels suspicious, love feels dangerous. I had to retrain my heart to receive goodness without shrinking, to accept love without questioning the motive behind it. I had to remind myself that gentleness isn't weakness, and that quiet doesn't always mean something bad is coming. And yet, even in that growing peace, grief would still visit me. Grief for the years I lost. Grief for the version of me who stayed longer than she should have. Grief for the dreams I buried just to keep the peace in a war zone I called home. But grief doesn't mean you're moving backward. It's part of the healing. I had to sit with it, hold it, let it speak. Because there were things I never got to say when I was in that house. Words I swallowed to keep the peace. Pain I dismissed because survival was more urgent. So, in this new space, this sacred, quiet season, I let myself feel, really feel. And in doing so, I began to recover parts of me I thought were lost forever. I started dreaming again. Not grand dreams at first. Small ones: a garden, a weekend trip with my kids, writing a devotional, leading a small group. Every dream felt like rebellion against the lie that I was stuck, that my life had already been decided. I realized that dreaming isn't just about ambition, it's about hope. It's a declaration that the future can look different than the past, that I don't have to live defined by what was done to me, but by what God is doing in me. And as those dreams grew, so did my courage. I began to tell my story more openly. At first, it was just with close friends, then at church, then online. Every time I shared, the enemy would whisper, "What if they judge you? What if they don't believe you?" But God always whispered louder, "Tell the truth. There's someone who needs to know they're not alone." And every time I spoke, someone reached out. A message, a tearful conversation, a quiet, "Me too." That's when I knew I wasn't just healing for myself. I was healing for others too. There's a unique power in testimony. The enemy wants us to stay silent, to stay hidden in shame. But the moment you begin to speak, shame starts to lose its grip, because light always drives out darkness. And your story, no matter how painful, becomes a beacon for someone still in the storm. That's what God was doing with mine. He was turning the weapons that had been used against me into tools for ministry. Still, it wasn't easy. There were days I wanted to stay hidden, days when old fears resurfaced. What if I fail? What if I fall back into old patterns? What if I'm not enough for this calling? But I had to remember that I don't walk in my own strength. I walk in His. And the same God who brought me out of the pit wasn't He going to abandon me on the climb. There were still healing layers I hadn't touched yet. Trust, for one. It was hard to trust people. I kept waiting for the mask to fall, for someone to show their true colors, for the kindness to turn into control. I even struggled to trust God, sometimes wondering why He let me stay as long as I did, why He didn't intervene sooner. But slowly, gently, He showed me. He had been with me the whole time. In the silent prayers, in the tear-soaked pillows, in the strength that rose up in me to finally leave. He was never absent. He was just patient, waiting for the moment I was ready to walk into freedom. I also had to heal my understanding of love. I had confused love with tolerance, with sacrifice, with enduring harm in the name of loyalty. But real love is safe. It uplifts. It honors, it protects, and learning to love myself the way God loved me was one of the hardest lessons of all. I had spent so long trying to be lovable by someone else's standards that I forgot I was already deeply loved before I performed, before I earned, before I proved anything. God began teaching me that His love doesn't look like control. It doesn't manipulate. It doesn't shame. It doesn't break you down to keep you near. His love builds, restores, redeems. His love doesn't rush the healing, it sits with you in it. And every time I ran back to Him, weary from the battle, He never said, "Why aren't you stronger by now?" He said, "I'm still here. I'm still with you. Let's keep walking." And walk we did together. Through triggers, through flashbacks, through guilt over feeling happy when others were still hurting, through the complexities, through rebuilding finances, confidence, and community, through the loneliness that sometimes followed freedom, because even though I was no longer in danger, I still felt like a stranger in my own life. But over time, joy returned. Not the loud, performative joy I used to fake in public, but the deep, quiet, kind, the kind that settles in your bones and says, "You made it, you're alive, and you are worthy of good things." I laughed more. I danced with my kids in the living room. I read scripture not as punishment but as nourishment. I let worship music play while I cleaned the house, and I cried not because I was sad, but because I was free. And freedom, my friend, is holy. Some people still don't understand my journey. They ask why I stayed so long, or why I talk about it now. But I've stopped trying to explain myself. I know the truth, and I know the one who walked with me through it. My story isn't for everyone, but it is for someone, and if sharing it means one more woman finds the courage to leave, to heal, to hope again, then it's worth every word. So I'll keep speaking, I'll keep healing, I'll keep walking in grace, because I'm not just a woman who survived domestic abuse. I am a daughter of God, a warrior in the quiet, a voice for the voiceless, a hand reaching out in the dark. I may still have scars, but they are no longer wounds. They are reminders that I lived, that I overcame, that I am living proof of what God can do with the broken pieces. To every woman still trying to find her way, don't rush your healing. Don't compare your pace to anyone else's. Just keep saying yes. Yes to rest. Yes to honesty. Yes to grace. Yes to the God who calls you by name. You are not who He said you were. You are not the weak one. You are not the crazy one. You are not the failure. You are beloved, redeemed, called, right here, right now. And He's not finished with you yet.